Elise had lived in the basement apartment for 3 months before she noticed the shadows weren't obeying the light anymore. But looking back, she wondered if they'd been watching her from the very beginning. From the moment she'd signed the lease with trembling hands, desperate for anything she could afford. The apartment had been too good to be true. Rent $300 below market rate, available immediately, no credit check required. The landlord, Mr. Henley, had been oddly eager to hand over the keys, barely glancing at her application. The previous tenant left in a hurry. He'd mumbled, avoiding her eyes. Left all the furniture behind. You can keep whatever you want. She should have asked more questions. Should have wondered why someone would abandon a perfectly good couch, a bed, even family photos still hanging on the walls. But Elise had been 3 days away from sleeping in her car, her savings depleted by her mother's medical bills and her own mounting credit card debt. She'd taken the apartment without hesitation. The shadows started small. She'd wake at 3:17 a.m. Always exactly 3:17. Her throat parched, feet finding the worn path across the carpet to the kitchenette. In those bleary moments between sleep and consciousness, she'd catch movement in her periphery. The outline of a figure in the corner by the water heater, darker than the surrounding darkness, perfectly still yet somehow present. She'd blink hard, shake her head to clear the fog of exhaustion, and flip on the harsh fluorescent light above the sink. The corner would be empty, of course. Nothing but the water heater's bulk and a cobweb she kept meaning to clean. Just tired. She'd whisper to herself, the words echoing strangely in the concrete space. New place, new sounds. Takes time to adjust. But adjustment never came. The basement apartment sat beneath a 1920s Victorian house that creaked and settled with every breath of wind. The previous tenant, a grad student named Marcus, according to the mail that still arrived, had lived there for 2 years before vanishing overnight. His coffee mug still sat in the sink, half full and growing a film of mold that Elise had finally scrubbed away in disgust. She'd found his journal wedged between the mattress and box spring when she'd moved the bed to vacuum. The final entry, dated just 3 weeks before her arrival, contained only one line repeated 17 times. They're getting closer. Elise had thrown the journal in the dumpster, but the words lingered. By her 4th week, the shadows had multiplied. What started as a single presence in the corner had become 3 distinct figures, each claiming territory in her cramped living space. One haunted the kitchen, a tall silhouette that seemed to bend at impossible angles to fit beneath the low ceiling. Another favored the bathroom doorway, its form wavering like heat shimmer, never quite solid but never entirely absent. The third, the one that frightened her most, had taken residence in her bedroom, standing vigil in the corner where the previous tenant had hung a mirror. The mirror was gone now, taken down the same night she'd caught the shadow moving independently of any light source. She'd been reading in bed, the lamp casting steady illumination, when she saw it lean forward in the reflection. When she spun around, heart hammering, the corner appeared empty. But the mirror showed the truth. A figure retreating, not vanishing, but deliberately stepping back into deeper darkness. She'd torn the mirror from the wall and shattered it in the dumpster, 7 years of bad luck seeming trivial compared to what she was already experiencing. The shadows never moved when she looked directly at them. But in her peripheral vision, they writhed with subtle life. She'd catch them shifting weight from foot to foot, tilting their heads as if listening to conversations she couldn't hear, occasionally raising what might have been arms in gestures she couldn't interpret. Sleep became impossible. The moment she closed her eyes, she could feel them pressing closer, their presence a cold weight against her skin. She started sleeping with every light on, but even then, the shadows found ways to exist. In the spaces between furniture legs, in the gap beneath her door, pooling in the curve where wall met floor. Her work suffered. As a freelance graphic designer, she relied on sharp focus and creative thinking, but exhaustion had turned her mind to fog. Clients complained about missed deadlines and subpar work. Her savings, already depleted, dwindled further as projects dried up. "You look terrible." Her sister, Rachel, said during their weekly video call. "Are you eating? Sleeping?" Elise wanted to tell her about the shadows, about the way they seemed to respond to her emotional state. Growing more active when she was stressed, more numerous when she was afraid. But how could she explain that her apartment was being invaded by entities that existed in the spaces between light and dark? Just adjusting to the new place. She lied, the same words she'd been repeating for weeks. Rachel's face creased with concern. "Maybe you should consider moving back home for a while. Mom's doing better, and I can't." The words came out sharper than intended. Going home meant admitting failure, meant accepting that she couldn't make it on her own in the city she'd dreamed of conquering. "I'm fine, Rachel." Really? But she wasn't fine. She was unraveling, thread by thread. By the 6th week, the boundaries had shifted. The shadows no longer confined themselves to corners and edges. She'd find them standing beside her bed when she woke, so close she could feel the displacement of air around their forms. They'd hover near her desk while she worked, their presence making the hairs on her arms stand on end. Once, while brushing her teeth, she saw one in the bathroom mirror standing directly behind her, its featureless face mere inches from her shoulder. She'd spun around to find empty air, but the mirror told a different story. The shadow remained, patient and watchful. The apartment felt smaller each day, the shadows claiming more territory, pushing her into an ever-shrinking island of safety that existed only in the brightest pools of direct light. She started carrying a flashlight everywhere, sweeping its beam across corners and doorways like a talisman against the dark. Her research into the building's history revealed disturbing patterns. 5 tenants in the past decade, all leaving suddenly, all abandoning their possessions. Before that, the basement had been storage space, but city records showed 3 suspicious deaths in the house above between 1952 and 1967. All ruled accidents, all involving falls down the basement stairs. She found old newspaper clippings in the library's archives. A factory worker named Harold Mills, who'd supposedly tripped carrying laundry to the basement. A young mother, Eleanor Vasquez, found at the bottom of the stairs with her neck broken, her toddler crying upstairs for hours before neighbors called police. A teenager named David Chen, discovered by his parents after what the paper called a tragic misstep. But it was the description of David's body that made her blood freeze. The boy had been found in the corner of the basement, not at the bottom of the stairs. His body positioned as if he'd been standing there, perfectly upright, until his legs simply gave out. Standing in a corner. Like he'd been waiting. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The shadows weren't just haunting the apartment. They were collecting. Each tenant who'd fled had left something behind, some piece of their essence absorbed into the darkness. And those who hadn't fled. She thought of Marcus, the grad student whose journal she'd found. His belongings were still here, but where was he? The landlord had claimed he'd moved out, but what if that wasn't true? What if he'd simply joined the shadows, becoming another watcher in the corners? That night, she didn't even pretend to sleep. She sat in the center of the room under every light she owned, surrounded by salt she'd bought from the corner market. A desperate attempt at protection based on half-remembered folklore. The shadows pressed against this barrier like living things testing a cage, their forms rippling with frustrated energy. At 3:17 a.m., they began to speak. Not with voices. She would have preferred screaming, wailing, anything recognizably human. Instead, they communicated through sensation. The temperature dropped until her breath misted in the air. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat not her own. And in her mind, unbidden thoughts that felt foreign and hungry. Join us. Stop fighting. Rest. The words weren't heard but felt, pressing against her consciousness like fingers seeking purchase on smooth stone. She understood, with a clarity that transcended exhaustion, what they wanted. They weren't trying to kill her. Death would be too simple, too final. They wanted her to surrender her will, to stop resisting, to let them in completely. Because once she gave up, once she stopped being Elise and became just another shadow in the corner, the cycle could continue. Another tenant would move in, drawn by the impossibly low rent and Mr. Henley's eager smile. And the shadows would have a new project, a new consciousness to slowly, patiently break down. She thought of Harold Mills, Eleanor Vasquez, David Chen. Had they felt this same creeping despair? This gradual erosion of self as the shadows whispered in their minds? Had they tried to flee, only to find themselves drawn back to stand in the corners of the basement, waiting for the final moment when flesh gave way to shadow? No. The word escaped her lips as barely a whisper, but it seemed to reverberate through the basement like a thunderclap. The shadows recoiled, their forms wavering. No. She said again, louder this time. I won't give up. I won't join you. But even as she spoke the words, she felt her strength ebbing. How long could she fight? How long before exhaustion claimed her, before she closed her eyes for just a moment and woke to find herself standing in a corner, another silent watcher in the dark? The shadows pressed closer, testing the boundaries of her makeshift salt circle. And Elise realized with growing horror that her defiance had only delayed the inevitable. They had eternity. She had only her failing human endurance. As dawn approached, painting weak gray light through the basement's single window, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier. She would run. Not just from the apartment, but from the city, from her dreams of independence, from everything she'd worked to build. She threw her essential belongings into 2 suitcases, leaving behind furniture, books, and the remnants of her old life. As she reached for the door handle, she felt them gathering behind her. All the shadows, all the watchers, pressing against her back like a wave of cold hunger. You can't leave. The sensation whispered. This is your home now. But she could leave. She did leave, stumbling up the basement stairs into the morning light, her heart pounding with each step. She threw her bags in her car and drove without stopping until the city disappeared in her rearview mirror. 3 days later, safely ensconced in her childhood bedroom at her mother's house, she called Mr. Henley to break her lease. He answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting by the phone. Leaving so soon? His voice carried an odd note. Disappointment mixed with resignation. That's a shame. The apartment really seemed to suit you. I found somewhere else. She lied. Of course you did. Don't worry about cleaning or anything. I'll take care of everything. These things happen. These things. As if tenants fleeing in terror was as routine as changing light bulbs. What about my security deposit? She asked. Keep it. Consider it compensation for the inconvenience. Before she could ask what he meant, the line went dead. That should have been the end. Elise threw herself into rebuilding her life in her hometown, taking on local design projects, slowly patching together her shattered confidence. The shadows became a memory, a strange chapter she tried to forget. But forgetting proved impossible. It started with dreams. She'd find herself back in the basement apartment, standing in the center of the room while familiar figures watched from the corners. In these dreams, she wasn't afraid. She was peaceful, content to simply stand and wait. When she woke, she'd feel a strange sense of loss, as if she'd been torn from somewhere she belonged. Then came the phone calls. Her number somehow appeared on rental websites, listed as a reference for the basement apartment. Prospective tenants would call asking about her experience living there. It's perfect. She'd hear herself saying, the words flowing without conscious thought. Quiet, private, very peaceful. The shadows are so restful. She'd hang up in horror, but the calls kept coming. And she kept answering the same way, as if some part of her had never left that basement corner. The final call came on a Tuesday evening in October, exactly 6 months after she'd fled. The voice was young, desperate. A college student named Amy who couldn't afford anything else in the city. The landlord gave me your number. Amy said. I just need to know. Is it safe? My parents are worried about me living alone in a basement. Elise opened her mouth to warn her, to tell her about the shadows and the watchers and the terrible patience of things that existed in corners. But different words emerged, spoken in a voice that sounded like hers but felt foreign. "It's wonderful," she heard herself say. "So quiet you could sleep forever. The corners are especially comfortable. You'll love it there." Amy thanked her and hung up, eager to sign the lease. That night, Elise stood in the corner of her childhood bedroom until dawn, perfectly still, waiting for something she couldn't name. When her mother found her there in the morning, Elise claimed she'd been sleepwalking. But she knew the truth. Part of her had never left that basement. Part of her was still there, standing in the corner, watching and waiting as new shadows joined the collection. And somewhere in the city, Amy was moving into an apartment with rent $300 below market rate, eager to start her new life in a place where the corners would never stay empty again.